Well, welcome back to our broadcast here live from the IMF and World Bank spring meetings. I'm joined right now by an important guest who's been very focused on rising food prices and their impact on the global economy. I'm speaking, of course, about Robert Zoellick, head of the World Bank. He joins me now live. You were sounding a warning about this just this morning. Tell me how the World Bank is taking steps to try to control what are skyrocketing food prices all around the world.
Well, there's different ways that we can help. One is on the production and productivity side, to use this as an opportunity for the developing world to produce more. And there, we're investing about $7 billion a year ourselves. We're trying to connect some of the countries with other types of investors. And there's things we're also trying to do on the research side, because part of this will be a question of having better seed varieties, deal with climate change and other issues. But there's also a critical point related to the volatility in the marketplace. And here, we're trying to work with some of the governments at this meeting and for the G20 to stop some of the things that would make the problem worse, such as export bans. Now, you're not going to be able to totally roll back export bans, but at a minimum, we'd like to see a code of conduct for a humanitarian purchaser, such as the World Food Program, to be able to access supplies. There are other things we could do to improve the information and quality and quantity of stocks around the world, including in some developing countries. And there's third, in some parts of the world, like the Horn of Africa, it probably makes sense to build some humanitarian stocks because you know there's going to be problems. The infrastructure isn't very good, so again, the World Food Program might run some of these in advance. So the key would be, when you have big market shifts like this, sometimes people want to use price controls or increase everybody's wages. That won't work. Let's focus on the most vulnerable, try to make the market work better, and then build the production and productivity over time, so make this a plus for poor farmers.
Well, as we meet here in China, leadership of some of those BRIC nations, some of the emerging economies, are having their own summit. Today, issuing comments saying they're worried about food prices skyrocketing, but they want more regulation. In some ways, pointing the finger towards speculation in the marketplace, perhaps adding to these price increases. What do you think of that?
Well, I'm not so sure. Brazil, for example, is one, as a major agriculture producer, is one of the BRICS, and I don't think it's been very keen on more regulation of agriculture markets. So some of that may refer to some of their concern about currencies and some of those issues than more on the food agricultural side.
Do you believe that that perhaps is skewing prices? And how much?
I think the main cause has been that stocks are relatively low. You had some weather events that you had very little cushion, but then it's combined with actually a long-term increase in demand in developing countries, which is not by any means a bad thing. People are eating better, they're eating more meat, but it means it takes longer to rebuild some of those stocks. So I think the catch here is, frankly, trying to thwart markets has not had much success in the world over time. The real question is, how do you try to make them work better, deal with the most vulnerable? It is true that these commodities are now an asset class. And so when you see money move in and out of commodity markets, that can have an exacerbating effect. But I don't think you can stop those flows. I think you want to try to focus on, as opposed to controlling prices, focus on those that are most hurt.
Your argument there saying this is about fundamentals and fundamental demand. I want to talk more about some of those factors and the different ways that those controls, inflation controls, are being handled all around the world. We got to take a real quick break here, though, and then we'll continue that conversation. Welcome back to In Business. I am Margaret Brennan. We're broadcasting a live special edition of In Business here from the spring meetings in Washington of the IMF and the World Bank. Rising food prices, just one of the issues at the top of the agenda right now as we continue to track this gravity shift towards the emerging markets, and a year that has had so many disruptions, it would seem, Mr. Zoellick, to the global balance of power. The Middle East uprisings there, just one of them. The Japanese disaster, another huge factor. And I want to talk to you about what is different this year. You have different parties at the table. Is it just a different agenda that perhaps demands more immediacy in action?
Well, the Middle East and North Africa, in my view, are historic events, and so that's got everybody's attention. But like revolutions elsewhere in history, this is going to have ups and downs and twists and turns. And so the question is, how can we try to support the process of change economically and politically while recognizing countries are in different conditions?
And that's a $500 million loan to Tunisia, perhaps more financial support?
Well, Tunisia, while it's still in its own political transition process and will still have the steps to build its new constitution and others, we we've been able to lean forward, put together a $500 million loan to support them in budget terms. But as part of that, they're also going to make changes about freedom of assembly, open information systems, their auditing and public accounting to try to build in greater citizen involvement and social accountability, something we've been recommending. At the same time, they're trying to work on some basic jobs programs, which are going to be very important. And that $500 million, we believe, will leverage about another $700 million from other players.
It seems like there's more about political economy focus than pure economics right now. But talk to me about how that disruption in the Middle East obviously has impacted fuel prices, and you are connecting the dots between that and the run-up in basic foodstuffs.
Yeah, what we've seen over the past 10 years is a much closer connection between food and fuel prices. Some of this is biofuels, but it's not all biofuels. Some of it is also the use of energy as an input in agriculture and fertilizer and the transportation. There's probably also something, and your viewers would probably know this better, about what's happening more generally in asset classes and commodity markets, maybe some concern about inflation and people putting money in their different commodity accounts. So you have a series of factors here. But of course, these then feed on each other because Egypt, for example, is a major wheat and food importer. So if you have energy prices increase, affects food prices, that adds to some of the social instability in Egypt and Tunisia. So we then try to focus on safety net programs that don't bust the budget, learning from what other countries have done. So all those things feed together. The other thing about this year is we're obviously at a different stage in the recovery, and one of the different stages is we've had a multi-speed recovery. So in the developing world, now representing about half of global growth, many of those countries have actually moved to the point where the danger might be overheating or asset price inflation. That's very different from Europe, where the question is sovereign debt, or the United States, where it's its budget deficit.
But on that note, with China, pulling back on interest rates, tightening up monetary policy, that's trying to control what you're talking about with inflation. In Europe, ECB just decided there's enough inflation for them to raise interest rates. Here at home, very different view of the world. How much is monetary policy playing into this run-up?
Well, when you say different
you seem
view,
skeptical.
No, what I'm saying is different view of the world. There's a lot of different views about that here, too, I think. And look, I'm not going to second-guess the Fed, but what I'm skeptical about is I think what's been driving up some of the pressure in some of the emerging markets is what would normally happen when some grow more quickly than others. You get additional capital flows to that. So there's fiscal policy, monetary policies. I really don't think this is driven so much by QE2. Now, there's other issues about QE2 and where that goes for the future. And I think you're putting your finger on a key issue, which is that for other countries, they're trying to say, are these food and energy prices transitory? Are they one time? Or are they going to start to be built in more over time? The fortunate part for the U.S. is that these energy and food prices are not as big a component of the overall price index as there are in some of the developing countries. It's the state of our development. But yes, that's going to be an issue that I think you're going to see debated.
So when you talk about this more sort of political economy view of the world, when you highlighted support in Egypt and in Tunisia and trying to grow more food, get at the fundamentals, your assumption is that this is going to continue to be a disruptive element in the global economy.
Well, I think if you simply look at population demands and income demands, there's going to be an ongoing increase in demand function, gradual over time. If you combine that with some of the uncertainties about stocks and you have supply disruptions, yes, that's going to add the volatility. So again, how do we try to make advantage of this, but at the same time deal with those danger points?
Well, those BRIC nations, though, are also saying while they have a seat at the table, they don't have a leadership position. Americans have been in your spot at the top of the World Bank for years now. Do you think that you'll be followed by World Bank President from the emerging economies?
That's for the shareholders to decide. At my level, I've been trying to increase the number of people we have now. The senior managing directors, all the next level below me, are all from developing countries, 2 of them from women, chief economists from China. But I will make this point. Be careful what the world asks for. I've spent much of my career trying to engage the United States internationally. And if you think that multilateral organizations don't have some degree of politics involved, think again. How many Americans have been UN Secretary Generals or head of the World Trade Organization or head of the regional development banks? And so my view is actually it's good for the United States to carry the responsibility of running some of these. Now, whether it's the World Bank or others, that's for others to determine. But I want America to be engaged in the world and these institutions.
It seems not only to be a choice, but a necessity right now, at least when you look at how globalized the financial markets are. Thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
It's great speaking with you, and thanks for having us here.